Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar featuring national security expert Gabriel Noronha. Thank you all for joining. As always, we appreciate your support of the important work that we do here at AMET. And in particular, please save the date for our annual Rays of Light in the Darkness dinner gala that will be held on November 19th in Washington, D.C. I hope to see you all there. Today's webinar will be recorded for later viewing, and I urge everyone to share the recording far and wide. An informed electorate is critically important to our national security and ability to survive in a very dangerous world, growing more dangerous every day. If you have any questions, you can place them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to get to as many as possible later in the program. Please do limit your entries to brief questions only. The U.S. is facing a frightening number of national security threats from a multitude of enemies across the globe. One would have thought that the unprecedented attack on U.S. citizens and U.S. soil on September 11, 2001, would have been a wake-up call to those government and military officials commissioned with the responsibility to keep us safe, as well as the precarious nature of our role as the world's sole superpower. And yet, 23 years later, Americans both at home and abroad are anything but safe, and the world looks like it's on the precipice of World War III. Joining us this afternoon to discuss all of this is national security expert Gabriel Noronha, who currently serves as the executive director of POLARIS National Security and as a fellow at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Please refer to the invitation in our website for a more in-depth description of Gabriel's extensive and impressive resume, which includes serving in the U.S. government and testifying before Congress. Welcome, Gabriel, and thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Laurie. Always great to be here with Matt.
Thank you. So given that our discussions today are taking place on the day after the 23rd anniversary of 9/11, I want to spend the first part of our conversation focusing on Islamist threats to U.S. national security, as well as the stability of the Middle East and our greatest ally, Israel, which is surrounded by those threats. So let me start with 9/11 itself. The attacks were hatched in a cave in Afghanistan by al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, who was being harbored by another terrorist organization, the Taliban. Besides being a result of intelligence and strategic failures, as well as perhaps a failure of imagination, was 9/11 the result of a misunderstanding of our enemy's desires to do us harm in America? I mean, al-Qaeda had attacked U.S. interests abroad, but never at home. And more importantly, have we learned anything? Because it seems to me that we're making the same mistakes. 9/11 led to both the Iraqi and Afghanistan wars, which were poorly ended by Presidents Obama and Biden, respectively. And now we're back to square one with the resurgence of not just al-Qaeda and ISIS, which Obama claimed to have destroyed, but also the Taliban, which Biden basically armed when he left $80 billion of armaments behind. And in this devastating report that was released on Monday, the House Foreign Affairs Committee set forth the results of its investigation into the botched Afghanistan withdrawal that led to the deaths of 13 U.S. Marines, as well as hundreds of Afghanis. Polaris put out a great summary of that report, and I urge everybody to go to the Polaris website to check that out. Gabriel, do you think anyone in policy-making positions has learned from these tragedies, or are we on our way to more terrorism, given the resurgence of these groups?
Well, I'm afraid that we have learned some lessons, but not enough, and that we are indeed really on borrowed time. I think if you look back at 9/11, there were a few elements that led us to disaster. One was, I think, as you mentioned, failure of imagination, failure to think creatively in how, if we were terrorists, how we might try to penetrate and compromise our system. And then the other one was, as you said correctly, misjudgment of intentions, means, and truly what was happening on the other side of the world that the public wasn't paying attention to. On September 10th, I think there was a classified memo that was set up to President Bush saying bin Laden was determined to strike the U.S. homeland. And so we had pieces of it, but we didn't have intentions mapped to compromised immigration system, matched to intent to pilot aircraft, for example. Three sort of separate key questions. If they had been linked together, we might have been able to stop that effort. I think if we look at where we are today, in the Middle East, we've seen a massive metastasization of terror groups. Afghanistan is back to where it was pre-9/11, but I would actually say it might be worse today because we now have not just al-Qaeda, which is present in all 31 provinces, which is housed in senior capitals and across every province, and as positions in guest house in Kabul. We also have ISIS-K, which is sort of the successor to ISIS in the region, and they are also in every province. They have plotted around a dozen attacks on over 8 countries across the world in just the last year. They have not succeeded in many of these, although we've seen some attacks in Europe recently, but they are gaining a stronger presence. A year and a half ago, General McKenzie, who was our CENTCOM commander, testified that they would be only 6 to 12 months away from having the ability to strike within our homeland with little to no warning. We are now within that range. One thing that I think complicates all of this is the position of our southern border. I've been to the border 3 times now. I'm going Monday and Tuesday again to Arizona. The last time I was there, again, 40 individuals walked around the end of the border wall right in front of me. 4 of those were from Syria. And those guys were looking for a better life, probably. But Syria is also the capital of where ISIS came from. The city these guys were from used to be controlled by ISIS. And it's likely that these individuals will be released back into the United States. We have a clear entry mechanism for would-be terrorists looking to come in. The ones who are intending to do us harm probably aren't going to get caught by law enforcement. If they have had significant training, they will know how to get through, trafficked in by the cartels, and have the ability to carry out attacks. I think this combination of threats, capabilities, and then the means to actually come into the United States. My theory is that we actually have significant sleeper cells, which have developed and hardened over the past few years, and that when attacks start, that we will see a series of attacks rather than sort of one isolated incident. They will become activated. I would actually fear most that would happen in a transition between presidents in January is when I would fear that most, when our national security officials are all cycling in and out of government.
It's very frightening. I know Polaris has spent a lot of energy and time on focusing on the border, and you just shared the exact reason why I'm happy that they are. I mean, President George W. Bush, in the wake of 9/11, had established the Department of Homeland Security, but under Alejandro Mayorkas's leadership, it's doing anything but keeping us safe and secure. So the other aspect of the border, now that you've raised it, is maybe you can talk a little bit, if you're aware of Hezbollah has a very large presence in South America, from what I understand, as far south as Argentina and Venezuela, and now up through Mexico. Our southern neighbor, Mexico, has been expanding its alignment with anti-US, pro-Iran Latin American governments like Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, Nicaragua, others. So how big of a threat is the Venezuela-Iranian alliance to us, and how does that play into the border?
So one other item I forgot, and then I'll address the Hezbollah part, is one thing that law enforcement has noticed is an ISIS-led smuggling ring that is pernicious and is focused on penetrating our southern border. That is the thing that worries me the most. And then the second level is, I think, this Hezbollah and Iranian axis that we're seeing metastasize throughout Latin America. They've been in Latin America in various degrees for the past 3 decades, but it used to be primarily focused on revenue generation. They realized they can get a lot of money through drug smuggling, through weapons smuggling, in through Colombia with the FARC originally, and now predominantly with Venezuela as its access point. So again, a lot of this is about generating sort of a diversified form of income generation away from Lebanon, away from the Middle East, and ideally away from the scrutiny of the United States. But what we've been worried about is that they would go further and use this to create terror cells in the United States. From about 2000 to present, we've had about 125 instances where the Department of Justice has prosecuted individuals inside the United States for allegiance or military support for Hezbollah. About 50 of those cases were centered in Michigan, where we've seen a huge amount of anti-Semitic acts, as well as you often see parades where Hezbollah flags are rolled out. And so this is both an economic campaign, a military campaign, and trying to almost create diaspora groups in Latin America where they can grow these communities. One thing that we see in the United States in places like Texas, but also Potomac, Maryland, New York City, Georgia, is what we call Islamic education centers. These are set up by the Iranian government. They are funded by the Iranian government, although the FBI shut down some of the mechanics of funding. And at these centers, you will see children being indoctrinated, singing allegiance oaths to Supreme Leader Khamenei. They will set up mourning ceremonies for Iranian President Raisi. And again, they regularly chant death to America at these education centers. So this is some of the mechanics that groups like these use to build a group of supporters and a base from Shia Muslims who are there, who get sort of brainwashed into believing that that their Shia Muslim identity requires allegiance to the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime has spent a huge amount of capital trying to make itself not just the religious center of Shia Islam, but the political center that owes allegiance to it. And that is something that concerns me considerably, again, as we talk about the whole Western Hemisphere.
You've made me think about what's going on our college campuses and the protests on the streets of New York City as well. You're seeing Hamas and Hezbollah flags being flown, and Hezbollah in particular was a little surprising, given that it has nothing to do with what these kids or grown-ups even are protesting about. So do you think that Hezbollah is also infiltrating college campuses and the more, naive or ignorant Americans as well?
I think there's been a probably 25-year ideological campaign that Hezbollah, Hamas, and others realize that they're key to both survival and defeat of Israel in their goal could not be achieved through feat of arms. It had to be done through political warfare. And their alliance that they chose to create was with the progressive left through politics of justice and injustice would be their entry point. And so they cultivated, recruited, worked very closely with leftist academics, professors on college campuses, and they've really targeted campuses as their place where they can get a lot of sort of young, subtle minds who are easily convinced of to join a cause. Again, social justice is one of their key tools that they try to use. And they have been very explicit about this. I recall there's a U.S. government official who told me of a time when he was working with officials in Lebanon, and they basically said, this is our plan. This is how we intend to advance our political interests. It's going to be developing the youth of America to have allegiance towards us and our ideological goals. Now, I think a lot of the kids who are flying Hezbollah flags have no idea what Hezbollah is. They don't truly understand this. And I think they are unfortunately brainwashed. But they're also adults who are breaking U.S. law and showing allegiance for a foreign terrorist organization, which is something that can get you to prison for 20 years if you materially support a foreign terrorist organization. And so I think we are really being let down by our college professors. If you go into any Middle East studies program or Islamic studies program on most college campuses, not all, but most, you will find professors who are not neutral arbiters and scholars of the subject. You will find activists who have obtained credentials as the master's and PhD students for the purpose of being able to go in and indoctrinate the next generation. They are activists who have gotten credentials, not scholars trying to impart knowledge. I think that's sort of the original sin here, is that we let these institutions fall from study and impartation of knowledge and trying to seek betterment of ourselves into trying to push an agenda on students. I think a lot of parents who have kids in college or recent students themselves see this, that their college professors are trying to get them to write a certain angle in a paper, come to certain conclusions. That's not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is intended to teach people how to think, how to come up to conclusions of their own accord, not to lead to a certain.
Okay, I'm going to move back to the Middle East right now and the implications of the Democrats' policy of pulling the U.S. out of the Middle East, as Presidents Obama and Biden have done. And presumably a future President Harris would do the same, since she has shared that she's been the last person in the room with these critically important foreign policy decisions like the Afghanistan withdrawal. Obama announced that he wished to transform America, which seemingly included removing us as a superpower, and he destroyed the Pax Americana that had kept peace in the region for decades. As watchers of our webinars know, Team Obama, Biden, Harris had a plan that Mike Duran and Tony Bedron called the realignment, which involved replacing the U.S. as the region's stabilizing force with the empowerment of the Islamic Republic of Iran as the new regional hegemon. So it's difficult to understand why U.S. leaders believe that if we leave the Middle East, the terrorists will just forget about us, rather than understanding that it's our presence and power that does keep the peace. Can you spend some time talking about the Islamic Republic's malign and hegemonic intentions and what Team Obama, Biden, Harris have done to empower them, including the $175 billion in sanctions relief? And how does this threaten not just Israel and our other allies in the region, but our homeland? I mean, you've touched on who's coming across our border. Do we have to worry about, you've mentioned sleeper cells. What other things do we need to be concerned about with Iran in the region and here at home? How do we get to the point where this Islamic Republic is also on the verge of becoming a nuclear power?
Well, I think a lot of people are familiar with Marxism, and they've maybe read Das Kapital, or people know what Hitler believed. Most people don't know what the Iranian leaders truly believe ideologically. When you go back to Ayatollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader, he wrote in his sort of key manifesto about the Islamic Republic that its goals were to cause the withered roots of imperialism, Marxism, and capitalism to wither, and that they should be replaced by a, quote, brilliant Islamic civilization. What he's ultimately looking for, and what his successor Khamenei and the people around him want, is a massive caliphate, similar in form to ISIS, what ISIS was trying to create, but with a Shia dominated form rather than a Sunni dominated form. In the view of the Islamic Republic, it's very similar to the Soviet Union. If you are not expanding, if you are not causing revolutions, you are losing and you're actually heretical. And so the Soviet Union collapsed, among many other reasons, because it went intellectually bankrupt, and they realized they weren't doing revolution anymore. They were just all corrupt. The Iranian system is very intent on maintaining and advancing the revolution. The way they've done this is they've tried to usurp governments that have any Shia elements in them, and try to make them the vassal state of Islam. So we've seen this in Lebanon with Hezbollah. We've seen this in Yemen with the Houthis. We've seen this attempted in Syria with Assad, although Assad's not Shia, he's a religious minority. And then what we've seen most importantly recently is in Iraq. And I think it's worth spending a little time on Iraq because a lot of Americans have forgotten about Iraq. We've been there for 20 years on and off. A lot of Americans are tired about it. We're just not interested in it. But the Iranian regime is very interested in Iraq. It's its next door neighbor. They fought the war, a very brutal war in the 80s. And so what Iran says is they want to subjugate Iraq, make it subservient to Iranian interests, effectively take out the Iraqi militias, military, and replace it with what are called the Popular Militarization Forces, the PMF, which are loyal to Iran. They have succeeded in a lot of this influence campaign. To be fair, over the last 10 years, both administrations, this has happened, this has deepened. What we're about to see from the Biden-Harris administration is complete surrender on this front. President Biden just announced, no one really paid attention to this, the intent to withdraw and draw down all U.S. forces from Iraq in the next 2 years. President Obama tried this. He left troops in Iraq in 2011, and we saw ISIS come back and sweep through the Middle East, sweep through Iraq. We saw huge amounts of Iraqi territory seized. Excuse me, by ISIS. We are going to see a repeat of that, except what we will see is the Iranian regime sweep through Iraq, completely take over institutions, and make Iraq a vassal state. If that happens, we will have ceded an enormous amount of territory, power, influence, and again, blood and treasure that we've invested in Iraq fall. So we tried the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We said, hey, we've been here too long. It's inconvenient. Americans don't want to be here. And the result was we went back to pre 9/11, but worse. The same thing is about to happen with Iraq. The parallel I like to point out is Korea. We've had troops in Korea since 1953, since the putative end of the Korean War. We haven't left because we know that North Korea would want to attack and take over South Korea, and we've decided to keep troops there to pay for peace, because the other side does not believe in peace. The other side believes in this war and this revolution and this conquest. And as a result, though, we've kept South Korea to be free, prosperous, and now they're able to defend themselves really on their own. 20 years in the span of an empire is just a blink, and we have this myopic ADHD mentality of, oh, we've been there a little too long, we're weary, we need to withdraw. The issue is we are simply ceding space to the enemy. I think President Harris will want to continue this withdrawal. They're also trying to make it very difficult for President Trump if he comes in to reverse this. It's going to be sort of, oh, well, this is already baked in. We've already made this agreement with the Iraqi government. It's time for President Trump to fulfill this. I think that would be a dangerous mistake if we leave Iraq. Not that I care about troops for the sake of troops. The question is, are we willing to surrender Iraq over to Iranian influence? What are we doing to fight that? Again, Iraq is a lot closer to Israel. It is building a path. Iran is building a pathway to the Mediterranean to be able to encircle Iran, to be able to encircle Israel. They've got Hezbollah from the north. They have increasing infiltration of Jordan from the east. They have the Houthis from the south, and they're trying everything they can to ultimately surround and destroy Israel. But then they're going to go for the other Arab states. It's not going to stop at Israel. It will go until they control the whole Middle East, and then again look at their ideological ambition, the whole world.
Thanks for that frightening information. I actually had not heard about Biden's plans to withdraw all U.S. troops from Iraq, and I mean, yeah, it's just frightening. So why do you believe, I mean, it seems to me that the U.S. hasn't done anything to really deal with Iran's plots to assassinate former senior U.S. officials here on American soil. And these include threats against John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Brian Hook, as well as President Trump himself. And earlier this year, FBI Director Chris Wray testified that, quote, foreign terrorists, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their adherents, have renewed calls for attacks against Jewish communities here in the United States and across the West in statements and propaganda. The foreign terrorist threat and the potential for a coordinated attack here in the homeland, like the ISIS-K attack we saw at the Russian concert hall a couple of weeks ago, is now increasingly, concerning. So is the government focused on addressing these homeland threats?
So there was good news, bad news last week. The Department of Justice arrested a Canadian Pakistani man who had written, turns out to law enforcement officials, that he was trying to do something that would make 9/11, that it'd be a 9/11 for the Jews. And his plan was to go to a Jewish community center in Brooklyn. He had plans for explosives, for mass attacks, and he wanted to slaughter Jews on the anniversary of October 7th, at presumably mourning ceremonies. Fortunately, this was stopped, but this is exactly the kind of event that the Iranian government is trying to support, that they are spending huge amounts of time, effort, and money to facilitate. We now know, thanks to actually U.S. intelligence, that Iran is spending money and resources funding protests against the Israel and the United States, creating propaganda online, inculcating and fomenting protests in Israel as well. They are trying to sponsor anti-government protests in Israel. This does not get the level of attention from the media that I think it merits. I think comparisons, if this were Russia doing it, I think we'd see a whole lot more concern when anyone was taking actions that were beneficial to the Russian government. We saw a lot of angst in the media on it, justifiably so, but we haven't seen that from Iran and their support of these activities. I was actually just in Congress briefing senior members of Congress about 2 hours ago on the Iranian terror threat. You know, what I like to point out is it's been 4 years now since some of these officials started becoming under threats. The U.S. government will stop if there's a guy with a gun coming towards New York City, they'll stop the guy. We are not doing anything to actually message consequences to the Iranian regime. We are not taking out their assassins on Iranian territory. The story I like to say is President Clinton, I think, is actually the exemplar on this. When H.W. Bush came under assassination threat from Iraq, Saddam Hussein was trying to assassinate him on a foreign trip. President Clinton fired dozens of Tomahawk missiles at the Iraqi Ministry of Intelligence to sort of send the message, you can't threaten American citizens with impunity. Even though you didn't succeed, the mere act of plotting this is unacceptable to America, and we will make you pay consequences, firm consequences on your homeland in response. That is the solution that President Biden should have taken these past 3.5 years. There have been absolutely zero penalties that Iran has suffered for plotting these attacks for the past 4 years. I think that's pretty insulting to our public servants of both parties who have served our government and deserve to live free from these threats.
Mm-hmm. I think Biden just likes to say don't and expect that people will listen, which we see has not occurred. So
not a great track record of success.
No. So we're now facing a new axis of evil in the form of strategic cooperation between Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea. And this involves arms sales, research and development of weapon systems, and I assume intelligence sharing. And while we knew that Iran was supplying Russia with drones, we just learned this week that the Islamic Republic is also sending ballistic missiles to Russia. So before we get into a more in-depth discussion about China and Russia and the threats they pose individually, how strong are the ties between these 4 countries, and what does this growing alliance mean from our national security standpoint? Can we look to the lessons of prior world wars, for instance, to understand when evil alliances are built, they inevitably require war to dismantle them?
So I think World War II is a really good proxy to look at. You look at Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, they didn't share ideologies per se, but they shared interests. And they shared information here and there, but they did not have this robust supply chain linking them together. There was a little bit between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the pre-war period, but the Soviet Union helped Nazi Germany rearm. But what we are seeing is combined supply chains, massive help from Iran, from North Korea supplying missiles, drones, ammunition into Russia to fuel its war machine. And that's going to be reciprocated in the form of advanced technology transfers, missile technology, and perhaps even nuclear cooperation in the coming years. What this poses is an even greater threat than in World War II, because these powers all have or are on the verge of nuclear weapons capability. I think that World War III has not broken out. I actually believe that we are in the process, that we are in the early stages of World War III. I think if we look back now and we look at 1939, 1940, we would say that's really the beginning of World War II, and we might not have acknowledged it until Pearl Harbor. I think we are just waiting around for our next Pearl Harbor to come. And I think that there's a lot of complacency in the West, in America, and Congress on this. We struggle to increase our defense budget. We actually haven't had any real inflation-adjusted increases to the defense budget in the past 3 years. Inflation has eaten away at all of that. We would, in a war with China right now, run out of long-range munitions 7 to 10 days, that war starting. We would lose 5,000 to 10,000 sailors in the first week of that. I don't think most Americans know that and are prepared for that. It's not a war we want, but if it's a war that China starts, it is going to be extremely, extremely painful for us. We do not have the industrial capacity to sustain it. if you look at Iran, Russia, China, they're spending in the range of 5 to 6% of their GDP on defense and military. The West, we are pretty much the highest at 3%. Europe is starting to hit the 2% mark. We're just not there yet. And we need to be in the mindset the war has started and we need to be prepared to win it. We're not on that perspective. And that can be really costly for us.
So I'm glad you brought up the military. So from what I understand, we're not reaching the recruitment numbers. We've got a woke military that's more focused on DEI, CRT type, transgender issues. I think under a Trump administration, there would be an awareness of the need to bolster our military. But in the Pentagon, is there an understanding that we've got serious issues that we're going to be confronting in the coming years, and we need to do something about it before it's too late?
So we have a recruitment shortfall of roughly 25,000 in the Army, 7 to 10,000 in the Air Force and Navy, 5,000 in the Marine Corps. This is pretty bad. I will say I attribute a good part of it to the DEI issues. The other issue that we have is this started 2016, 2017. What we are seeing is two fundamental flaws. A lack of patriotism in today's youth that I think is a cultural manifestation on today's culture. And the other one is physical fitness. We only have about a third of today's youth, maybe even as low as a quarter, are physically eligible to serve in the military because we're overweight or we have other issues. And then of those people who are actually willing to serve gets us down about 7% of American youth who are willing and able to serve. And then a good chunk of them are going to universities and lawyers, also some other valuable professions. So we have these twin crises of health and patriotism that I think are conspiring in a long-term problem. Our kids are not getting any healthier or any lighter, and they're not getting any more patriotic. I think after 9/11, we saw a massive surge in patriotism because we were attacked. Again, this issue of, and I think we've seen this in Ukraine. Once Ukraine was attacked, people surged and were mobilized and were able to do a lot of incredible things. Same thing that we've seen in Israel. But don't we all wish that we had been prepared 2 months, 2 years before those wars? Same thing's going to happen here. If we're attacked, we will see that surge of patriotism. We will see that surge of recruitment. But the best way we can win a war is to prevent it from happening in the first place. I think that requires, again, changing our cultural conversation that being in the military is a valiant thing, that you're not going to be a baby killer. There's a lot of actually really great career tracks in the military. People in the Pentagon worry about this, but my concern is they're not serious about the solutions.
So I'm going to pivot to China. On the Polaris website has a policy memorandum that states the following, quote, "The CCP is the greatest danger to America since the Soviet Union. It aims to overtake the US-led liberal international order and replace it with authoritarianism that uses military coercion to advance China's interests. China threatens our military superiority, economic and technological security, and social fabric." The memorandum goes on to note that, quote, "Inadequate action has been taken to enhance our defense posture, confront the CCP's manipulative trade practices, block its espionage tactics, and deliver accountability to woke companies kowtowing to Beijing." So can you elaborate on all of this, Gabriel, including, that you also mentions that the U.S. is in a Cold War with China, and how that plays into our state of being on the precipice of World War III or the early stages of World War III. And is the U.S. acknowledging this Cold War with China? Please also, touch on the domestic spying that we continue to discover, including in the Hochul administration last week.
So I think if you look at the Soviet Union, vast capabilities, but then you look at their technological state, very, very behind the United States. You look at their economic state. They were a tenth of the size of the United States, I believe, in their economy, versus China today, on par on GDP. They are producing far more patents today than we are in the United States. Their defense budget is actually about 700 billion compared to 850, 900 billion for ours. So they're close on that military budget. And they are efficient, ruthless, and they have penetrated, frankly, all aspects of American business and technological, perhaps military and political institutions as well. There's a story in the Wall Street Journal today, which I think is sort of indicative of this. Most American ports today have their cranes and that entire technology. They bought that from China. And China installed internet devices on all these cranes to basically collect and be able to disseminate all that information back to Beijing. They also have the ability, likely, to be able to entirely turn off and sabotage their own cranes at will. If we were in the war with China in the Pacific and we were trying to load troops, load material onto our ships using these cranes, they can just shut them off in the event of a war, and it'll be a complete disaster for us. This is a threat unlike anything that the Soviet Union posed. They didn't have us compromised that way. It's like this on virtually every facet that we are in the process of trying to kick them out. What I'll give the Biden administration a little credit for is they continued, I think, President Trump's wake up on China. They are not, they do not sort of, they admit that there's a problem. I think their solution is lacking. They believe that there's an accommodation that we can find with China, that we can smooth some of these relations out and have smooth sailing. I think that's naive. And I think if you look at the track record, every time they give a concession to China to try to stabilize the relationship, it's usually China provokes us, China steals something, they attack our ship somewhere, and we say, our response is going to be to de-escalate the situation so that this doesn't get out of hand. And as a result, China has gotten away with taking vast numbers of actions across the on the military side, we're in a really dangerous place. China has declared its ambition to be able to attack Taiwan by 2027. That's just 2.5 years from now. I think we've shifted that a little bit. There's been a lot of Chinese problems within the Chinese military. They don't actually have the training, the readiness that they're hoping for. Xi Jinping is pretty upset, actually, with a lot of his top generals to the state of the Chinese military. So I think we've bought a few years through good luck and also seeing Russia's complete failure in Ukraine has been a good thing for us. But China is producing more ships in one shipyard in China than the entire U.S. naval fleet combined. Currently, we have about 300 ships in our U.S. Navy. China is at 350 right now, and they are set to be at 450 in 2030. In 2030, we will still be at 300 ships. The issue here is also, if we go into war, there's going to be a lot of ships sunk on both sides. We will not have the ability to replace them or repair them. China will be able to do that 5 times, 10 times faster than we can. We are in a really serious place with our shipbuilding capacity having been completely decimated by mismanagement, by lack of consistent budgets, and by the fact that we've let all of this work go to other countries. I was in Korea last week. In one of their shipyards, one of their commercial shipyards, they can build 35 ships a year. That's also the entire output of the U.S. entire shipbuilding industry across our entire country, and one Korean shipyard. So we've lost a lot of these skills that we actually need to be able to compete with China. These are the things that the Biden defense budget does not prioritize. They prioritize spending on climate over defense. Now, that's a choice. There are people that might legitimately believe that climate is a greater threat than Communist China. I don't agree with that, but that's the prioritization that they've made. The consequence is, well, we might lose a war to China if that happens.
Very frightening. Thank you for all of this information, Gabriel. So with regard to Russia's war in Ukraine, Polaris notes, quote, "It is critical to remind Americans the Biden-Harris administration has failed at one of the most important tasks facing American presidents since 1945, preventing wars of conquest on the European continent. There have been three critical faults with Biden-Harris policies: a failure to deter Moscow, a failure to equip Ukraine, and a failure to weaken Russia's economy, which funds the war effort." So can you elaborate on this and explain why ensuring Ukraine victory is important to promote U.S. national security interests? And this is an issue, I think, that on both sides of the aisle, it needs to be explained a little bit more. And I like that you had pointed out that with regard to China's possible invasion of Taiwan, seeing Russia's issues is one benefit that we've seen as a result. But can you talk a little bit more about Ukraine?
So if we're thinking about how do we prevent Iran from going nuclear, how do we prevent China from invading Taiwan, we have to have the credible defense and the credibility that it's too painful for others. And I think the fact that we failed at preventing Russia from invading Ukraine is one of the greatest blunders that we will have seen for the earliest part of the century, that we allowed Russia to invade Europe. That had been the bulwark of U.S. foreign policy from 1946 onwards, that we would not allow this to happen. And we failed because we did not threaten Russia with severe enough consequences. They looked at the sanctions package that we had promised and they said, this is nothing. They believed, mostly accurately, that they had compromised a lot of European politicians and could get them to avoid pressure, which they largely succeeded at. And then they believed falsely that they would be able to just roll into Kyiv and take over the country. So they misjudged on their intelligence. But if you look at the essential thing is they misjudged or they judged correctly that the consequences for them invading wouldn't be severe. There have been dozens, maybe hundreds of sanctions that the Biden team has refused to put on Russia. The Europeans have refused to put on Russia because it might inconvenience re-election campaigns. For example, oil. They refuse to sanction Russian oil still to this day because they're concerned the price of the pump might increase. They're concerned the price of the pump might increase because they know that hurts their re-election prospects. The solution to this, the way we were able to sanction Iran's oil in the Trump administration, was we pumped a whole lot more here in the US. And so we took 2 million barrels off the world market of Iranian oil, and we replaced that with US oil predominantly, and then a bit of other oil from other countries. If we believed in energy production ourselves, we could do this to Russia. But again, it's this fascination with closing down American oil production and then going to Iran and going to Venezuela and saying, can you guys pump more? Because we need to supply the oil markets. Venezuela is one of the dirtiest oil producers in the world. They've had 72 oil spills in 1 year. Neglecting American oil and energy production in favor of Venezuela is the greatest climate crime you can commit. And so I don't think that makes any sense. So we failed on deterring Russia. We can't fail on Iran and China because the consequences to American national security interests I think are even worse than losing that deterrence with Russia. On the equipment front, look, I think equipping Ukraine with American weapons is something that the vast majority of Americans support, but we don't want to do it forever. We don't equip Ukraine for the sake of equipping Ukraine. We don't want to spend taxpayer dollars forever. We want Ukraine to win, and then we want to stop sending them weapons and stop sending any US taxpayer dollars. The issue with the Biden approach is that they have given Ukraine enough to survive, but not enough to win. They have delayed every single weapons shipment that's been important. They've downgraded every weapons request that Ukraine has received because they don't want to provoke Russia. Russia had already invaded a sovereign country. You can't provoke a country to do much more than that. And so what we want is give Ukraine the weapons they need to win the war and then get out and end it. We have spent about $150 billion given to Ukraine in the last 2.5 years. I'm glad we have. I wish we had never had to spend $1 of that. And if we had had the right policies, we wouldn't have to. And if we take the right policies in the future, we can make one last payment and then call it a day. I think that's what we'd like to see here at Polaris, certainly.
Yeah, yeah. So the war in Ukraine hasn't stopped Russia's advancements in Africa. In particular, the Sahel region, in which the US's position has greatly decreased, including our withdrawal from Niger. I think that presents opportunities for Russia while negatively impacting our ability to deal with Islamist movements and our counterterrorism efforts there. How concerned should we be about the long-term implications to our national security of losing our presence in this area of the world?
I think 2 decades ago, we talked about how the future was Asia. And that's true. I think they are currently the present. And if you look at economic output, number of people, all that. I think if we're looking at the rest of this century, the future is going to be significantly in Africa. They are going to account for almost the entire world's population growth. They're going to add 2 to 3 billion people over the next few decades. Currently, Africa is set up to be a massive nightmare the way it is going right now. It is surrounded with terror groups. There are very few jobs. There are very few houses for people. They're going to turn to terrorism in desperation. And if we think that that won't affect us here in the United States, we're being very naive. In the same way that some of us thought, oh, the Middle East is far away. Russia's goal is to foment a lot of this, to profit from it, and then to destabilize the United States and Europe from its underbelly. So they love to see war in Africa because that creates huge migrant flows that then they go up into Europe and they cause all sorts of problems for the Europeans. We've now seen at our southern border, it's not primarily Mexicans coming through our southern border. It's people from all over the world that manage to get an airplane ticket to Bolivia, and then they hike up or take a train up to Mexico, and then they go into our border. And so this is important to us for our own economic and national security reasons too. We've lost huge amounts of ground in the Biden administration in Africa. We've been kicked out of 3 countries. We lost our military base in Niger. And the people who walked into that military base were Russian mercenaries. They were literally moving into our barracks as we were leaving, and in Mali as well. So what we've seen is ISIS's real home and Al-Qaeda's true operational center now is no longer in the Middle East. It's actually in Africa is where we're seeing the bulk of Boko Haram, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda recruitment, their membership grow. Right now, it's a lot more focused on sort of local conflicts and local battles. It will move to the West next. And I think we are going to have to dig out a lot of the next few years. We're already trying to dig out and try to reestablish basing and abilities there, but we never should have lost in the first place.
So we only have a couple questions in the queue. Anybody that has anything to ask Gabriel, feel free. I'm going to just ask him one more question before I turn to the questions posed by the audience. And it's a general question, Gabriel. You know, we've got this Reagan doctrine, peace through strength. What would you suggest that any incoming administration do to strengthen our national security and defenses against all of these enemies who seek to harm us? And how quickly do you think that we can turn things around?
I think there's 2 things that are the most important. There's money, which is important. You always need money. You need to be able to pay for a larger military, pay for the munitions that we need to win wars, pay for intelligence collecting capabilities. That's almost the easy answer. The harder answer, which I think is more important, is you need to show U.S. resolve and credibility. If an American is injured or killed by a foreign adversary, we need to respond decisively. We need to respond disproportionate. If one American is killed by Iran, we need to be killing or destroying significant parts of the regime. Not if you go and do a tit for tat and you kill one Iranian, the regime does not care about their grunts. They do not care about their pawns on the front. They care if their regime leaders are hurt. They care if their buildings in Iran are hit by missiles. That would deter them. And I think what's more important is it would send a message to Russia, to China, to others like Venezuela and Cuba, that we're not going to get pushed over. And so even something like that is a great indicator of intent and resolve. And it is cheap for us Economically, it doesn't cost that much money to do an overwhelming response to that. It is difficult reputationally and difficult politically, but it yields really strong outcomes. And I think what I'm concerned the most with right now is that people believe the United States is a pushover, and they believe that it can get away with a lot. We really have to reverse and dispel that notion if we want to prevent our enemies from taking advantage of us.
So I'm going to turn to the audience questions and get some of these in before our time is over. How reliable is the U.S. support of Israel? What are Israel's options if the U.S. support is in doubt?
So I think this depends on the political party. I think if you look at Republicans are quite overwhelmingly supportive of Israel. When I talk to members of Congress, there's zero daylight. There's zero desire to fall victim to Hamas's propaganda or extortion. And the view of Republicans is we want to be with Israel until they wipe out every single last Hamas member, and work with them to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon that can threaten them. There's a lot of support on the Republican side for continued military assistance to Israel. I would note we are under a lot of budget stress, trying to support Ukraine, trying to support Taiwan and their defense. There's a lot that we need to be doing in Asia. I think on the military thing, the one thing that I think about is, yes, I want to support Israel. They do have an economy. Their economy hasn't been hit as bad as Ukraine's is. I hope that they can continue to do what they've already been doing, and support themselves a lot on the financial side, just because we are stretched so thin across the world. We should never put, and I don't think any Republican supports any type of arms embargo, any type of arms restriction to Israel. What we've seen on the side from Kamala Harris is a real willingness to impose an arms embargo, strong hesitation for political, not economic reasons of sending weapons to Israel, criticizing them left and right, caving to Hamas propaganda, falling victim to Iranian extortion threats. And really what I'm worried about is that the Democrat Party as a whole is going in the direction of abandoning Israel wholesale. They aren't there yet because there's enough Democrats, especially Jewish Democrats, who have said that this is the most important thing to them and that they will provide a political penalty to anyone that caves. It is in real doubt, and I think partly because of what we've seen on campuses and in academia is there's a persistent, advanced group on the left that is trying to undermine the Democrat Party's support. I think it's incredibly supportive and important that we have allies like Richie Torres, several Senator Fetterman and others who are doing incredible work to keep that part of the Democrat Party's support for Israel strong. I do not trust President Harris to do the right thing. Again, if there are certain Democrats who I'd say I'm not worried about this. Harris has been held captive by her progressive base on issue after issue, and so I'm concerned about how she might.
So a couple of people have asked, what would Trump do differently? Do you think Trump will be any better since he wants to keep us out of war and not have troops in hostile areas? And I love that this is being posed to you, Gabriel, because you did serve in Trump's first term. So you can share with our audience your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, what I saw was Israel had no greater friend than President Trump. I mean, if you look at recognition of the Golan Heights, recognition of Jerusalem as the embassy, all the things we did with Iran, and really what I saw was we were hand in glove with the Israelis every day in the Trump administration. Yes, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have had ups and downs in their relationship. That's something that's going to have to be worked out. But I think on the substantive technical side, I think we saw really great cooperation. And what I would expect in a second Trump administration, a real focus on putting pressure back on Iran, putting Israel's enemies on the defensive rather than having Israel be on the defensive.
And generally from a national security standpoint as well, not just Israel.
Yeah. And that's going to be the same on China. China's going to be put on the back foot. Russia's going to be on the back foot. One of my big issues with current policy is we are constantly the responsive one. Others provoke, others do something to us. We have to defend. We have to figure out how we're responding. It's good to have the enemy on the back foot, and have us be advancing sanctions and having them be the ones calling us and trying to get us to de-escalate rather than the other way.
So Sarah Stern actually asked if you could comment on the amount of fatalities in the Sudanese war, for example, and why there is an obsession with the war that Iran has imposed on Israel on 7 fronts, as opposed to any focus on what's going on in Sudan.
You know, I sometimes see the slogan "Free Sudan," which I'm curious of whether they support the Janjaweed or whether they support the Sudanese armed forces, both of which have committed humongous human rights atrocities. So I've asked, I've never gotten a response there. There's 5 million plus Sudanese in famine today. We have seen 50,000, but it's probably more like 250,000 for being realistic, die in the last year and a half of the war. There's some horrific pictures coming out of there of, again, children starving, of people being pretty much just skeletons. And we've seen almost no media coverage of this. The Sudanese war is a real tragedy because Sudan, when we left it in 2020, was in a really good place. We had just taken Sudan off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. They were working towards a better future. And we've seen every part of that completely collapse. Khartoum used to have 4-star, 5-star hotels. Those are all destroyed. And there are no great answers there. This war is being fueled by all sorts of different actors. The Russians are involved, the Emiratis are involved, the Turks are involved, the Egyptians are involved, all from different, Libyans are involved, all from different sides, each trying to sort of extract their own leverage, their own access to natural resources, their access to the ocean. And we've frankly seen almost no emphasis from this administration on. Secretary Blinken has visited Israel, I think, 8 times since October 7th, with very little to show for it. He's been to Africa a total of 4 times in his 4 years now. Again, I'm all for go visit Israel. If there's something that you're actually doing that's useful, that's fine. But he has 0 results to show for it. He's completely neglected Africa. You know, one interesting tidbit: for the past 30 years, the very first visit from the Chinese foreign minister has always been to go to Africa. And they've understood the importance of building those relationships, building influence, building trade networks. And as a result, China trades 9 times more with Africa than we do. We give 9 times more aid. That has not bought us leverage, has not bought us influence, and has not bought us security. China has done the economic influence operation far, far more successful. So I think the whole structure, the way Secretary Blinken and President Biden have done this, is misguided. Biden has not been to Africa in his presidency, to my knowledge, unless I don't believe he has. Again, it's just ignoring the conflict. You barely ever see comments from it. You don't see top leadership going and trying to solve it. And I think it's a really wasted and tragic outcome there.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. I learned a tremendous amount, and I'm hoping that everybody shares this recording far and wide, because we covered a lot of ground. And for anybody interested, Polaris has a number of important policy papers on the website. But Gabriel, can you tell us again? It's
Polaris-us.org.
So please check it out. I actually have a summary of President Harris's foreign policy, national security statements, and what you view to be shortcomings in the future Harris administration as well. So I urge everybody to take a look at that. Thank you again for joining this afternoon to everyone. And Gabriel, once again, appreciate it and look forward to having you back another time.
Thanks, Laurie. Appreciate it. Thanks all.